Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new session dedicated to moving abroad to Italy. I'm Jessica, co founder of Aleson Italy, a company based in Italy that helps foreigners settle, invest, and start their business in Italy. The purpose of this webinar is to learn the key steps to settling in Italy, the mistakes to avoid, and how to get the right support. Before we begin, I'm going to go into a bit more detail about Aleon Italy. We are a team of about 50 professionals, each with their own area of expertise. We work with accountants, lawyers, interpreters, and administrative assistants. We have partnerships with banks and insurance companies, which is a major advantage because it allows you to have a complete team within a single company and avoids having to try to contact each professional individually who may not respond or may not be able to advise you based on your situation. So the goal is to have a single team that can take care of your project and provide you with the best possible advice. We know that generally projects are very interconnected. So sometimes, for example, an expatriation can be linked to a real estate purchase or to starting a business. So the goal is to have all the professionals gathered within a single organization. Generally, we assemble a team around the project, usually with 3 or 4 professionals, and typically a main contact who answers all your questions and helps you, let's say, structure your project. We have the administrative team that handles, for example, all the procedures such as property searches, obtaining a tax code, opening bank accounts, and applying for residency. And generally, after that, we have the accountant, who is an essential ally for any project because usually there are incomes and investments coming from abroad, or sometimes particular situations that require a thorough analysis to avoid double taxation, optimize all tax matters, and let's say organize finances. We have been assisting foreigners who moved to Italy for several years. We realize that it's difficult when you don't speak the language to get in touch with the authorities to understand how things work and to avoid making mistakes. So we created Aleson Italy precisely to coordinate the different steps, to inform you, to explain to you a bit about what's happening, because sometimes people are surprised that the Italian system works differently from a foreign system. Sometimes you also come across dishonest people, so we also play the role of guide and support by your side. We know which procedures can be done remotely. We know which ones require your presence. This way, we also try to optimize your trips and, as a result, the costs. These are criteria that you absolutely must take into consideration for your project. Within Aleson Italy, we are very committed to raising awareness, as too many people still find themselves in complicated situations and become discouraged when facing expatriation or a project in Italy. So every week we organize webinars precisely to give you as much information as possible to help and guide you step by step in your project. The unique aspect of Aleon Italy is that all services are available online. You have the option to book your services flexibly. By paying the deposit, you are directly put in touch with the professional providing the service. You also have the possibility through our configurator on Aleon Italy to create your own personalized support package. That means you can choose a la carte services or opt for comprehensive packages to fully support your entire project. So that's a bit of what makes Aleon Italy unique. We've created a structure and a team that is at your service. You don't have to worry about whether someone will respond to you or how much the service costs, because everything is available transparently. Sometimes people ask us at what stage we get involved. Is it when you found a property? Is it when you're already there on site? In reality, we get involved right from the start. We can step in from the very beginning, meaning that even before you leave, to help you look for a property, a good area, or a job, we can work together to lay the foundations for your move abroad. We are also there during the move in process, helping with setting up contracts, assisting with property viewings, for example, organizing your move, and afterwards, let's say, for all the administrative tasks, opening utility accounts, setting up home insurance, and so on. So you have complete 360-degree support. You know that you can count on, let's say, a company that supports you step by step and is there from start to finish. Before you even leave, we can already start taking care of the initial steps. So where do you start? The first step is obtaining the tax code. So the tax code in Italy is absolutely necessary for all procedures, such as opening bank accounts, signing a rental contract, buying property, residency, and setting up utilities. In fact, all procedures are linked to the tax code. So it's an identification code that allows you to be recognized in Italy. So this tax code can be requested from abroad at the nearest Italian consulate. There is one in every country, or directly in Italy at the Agenzia delle Entrate. So you make an appointment online and you will request your tax code depending on the consulate and the country. There may be some difficulties in obtaining it. So you should try this process first. In any case, we can help you obtain it. If you are in a non-EU country, be aware that the Agenzia delle Entrate in Italy will not provide it to you directly. Generally, you need a good reason. So, for example, a purchase offer, acceptance into a university, etc. So first step, tax code. Try to apply for it as early as possible because once you have it, it is valid for life and at least you can start your steps right away, so to speak. Next, check all your identity documents. It may seem trivial, but we regularly have people who arrive with expired documents, and it's always more complicated. From Italy, the competent authority is therefore the consulate of your country. So this is generally always slower and more tedious because you don't necessarily have one close to where you are. So if you can anticipate this part, it can make things easier for us later on, or at least not make them more complicated. The visa part only concerns non-EU citizens. That is to say, if you live in the European Union, there is no problem. You can come to Italy without needing a visa. Those who live outside the European Union also need a visa in order to settle in Italy. We will take a closer look at this in detail in a little while. If you have the possibility to find a job before coming, and if you can start your housing search from abroad, this is something that will definitely help you once you arrive. Be aware that having Italian income, in any case, a job in Italy or steady income, will always make it easier for you to find housing. So generally, these two aspects are very closely linked. Priority should be given to employment or, in any case, to financial resources in order to feel more at ease when it comes to housing. We try to anticipate all the administrative procedures so that we can feel a bit more at ease upon arrival. We try. There are so many things to think about that I always advise you to try as much as possible to take care of everything that can be handled from abroad. Once you're there, what do you do? So, what do you need to do? For those who are from outside the EU, they have to take an additional step, which is to go to the police headquarters to obtain a residence permit. This gives you 10 more days. Generally, you need to do this within 8 days after your arrival. So be careful if you are from outside the EU not to miss this step, which is an additional procedure you need to complete. For everyone else, since they don't need to go through this process, we move directly to the residency application. So it's clear that applying for residency is mandatory. Once you start to settle in, let's say you have a rental contract, you have a work contract. After 3 months of permanent residence in Italy, you must, it's mandatory, apply for residency at the town hall. We'll discuss this step in more detail a bit later, but keep this step in mind. When do you apply for residency in Italy? It's when you want to spend the majority of your time in Italy, generally more than 183 days in the year. So this too is a rule. Keep in mind that if you want to live in two countries at the same time, you still have to choose the one where you are permanently residing. In connection with residency, depending on your situation, you need to register with the Italian healthcare system. We will also talk about this in more detail in a moment, but generally, you establish residency and then immediately register with the healthcare system. Depending on the situation, you can sometimes do it at the same time or even beforehand. So we'll look at the different cases in a little while. So setting up utilities and taking out home insurance is usually done as soon as you have the accommodation. Keep in mind that home insurance is not mandatory in Italy. It's always recommended but not required. As a foreigner in Italy, you have the option to obtain an Italian identity card. However, it will only be valid within Italy. But why is it important? Because it will allow you to activate your digital identity, known as SPID. So you can request your Italian identity card at the town hall of your residence and at the same time activate your SPID through an online service such as Poste Italiane or Aruba, for example. They will need to verify your identity either in person or via video and then activate this digital identity. This is a right that you have. So just remember, and it's even written on it, it is only valid in Italy. So if you decide to come to Italy while renting accommodation, be aware that there are a few particularities. The long-term rental market in Italy is very dynamic. Generally, what happens, given that there is a lot of tourist demand, generally property owners use their accommodation for short-term rentals because on the one hand, it offers more security since the property is vacated quite frequently. Secondly, there is indeed the possibility of earning more since we know that you can rent for a higher price per night than for an entire month. And so this creates a shortage of housing. So in most Italian cities, at least, it is sometimes easier to buy than to rent. That being said, for a first stay, renting is the best option. Since there is more demand than supply, you need to have a strong application. Generally, they favor stable incomes, permanent contracts, and the fact that there are no pets. Because if they have the choice, sometimes it's even written in the ad. Even if it's not exactly legal, they do it anyway. You should know that Well, afterwards, we have very little recourse since the landlord can always say that the application wasn't strong enough, and that's why they didn't select the candidate. So, what should you do in these situations? Generally, I advise you to move away from city centers to have more opportunities to find housing and to face less selective criteria for getting an apartment. In the event that you do not possess a substantial number of financial guarantees, one strategy that can often prove effective is to propose paying several months of rent upfront in advance in order to fully reassure the landlord and significantly improve your overall likelihood of successfully getting the apartment. The last option is to opt for insurance in case of missed payments, which also helps reassure the landlord. You have to keep in mind that it's a very fast moving market. So sometimes apartments are rented out within the same day. So you shouldn't start looking too far in advance, but also not at the very last minute either. A few days before the viewings is ideal. If you have the chance to be there for a while to search for a place and lock it in as soon as possible, that's really great. Generally, it's first come, first served. So whoever reserves it first gets priority. What type of contract do you usually get for renting? The standard contract is 4 years plus another 4 years. However, it's a bit strict. There's a 6 month notice period, and you have to leave a deposit of 3 months' rent plus 1 or 2 months' rent as agency fees if the apartment is managed by an agency. The apartment is usually unfurnished. Be aware that there is no kitchen, so you either have to buy it from the previous tenant or plan for these additional costs as well. If you're in Italy and considering buying a place, or if you're only staying for a certain period, you have the option to choose a transitorio contract, which is a shorter term contract usually set for a period of 1 to 18 months maximum. Now, these contracts generally require a specific reason, for example, a 6 month university enrollment, a 3 or 4 month fixed term work contract, and so on. So you usually need to be able to justify it, but it can be a flexible option compared to the standard contract. So keep in mind that renting an apartment isn't exactly simple and you need to have a good strategy. In any case, we can help you with your property search. So if you have a project, I'll leave the link below so you can schedule an appointment and we can discuss your project in detail. The second option, if you want to find housing in Italy, is to buy a house. Sometimes, as I was saying, people prefer to buy a house because they are unable to find a rental. So in that case, they go straight to buying. What you need to keep in mind is that generally it takes about 3 to 6 months to finalize a transaction in Italy. If everything goes well, it can be done in 30 to 40 days. We have a dedicated webinar on this topic, but in any case, I wanted to already give you some important information regarding the listed price. So the price shown in the ad, be aware that agency fees are not included. So if the property is managed by an agency, you also need to factor in agency fees, notary fees, taxes, and all the additional costs that may be added, such as inspections, certificates of compliance, the surveyor's visit, etc. Generally, you should expect to add about 15 to 20% to the listed price. I always round up to 15 or 20% because that really gives you a general idea of the kind of support involved. Sometimes you also need to plan for an interpreter on the day of signing, as well as the translation of documents for those who wish to apply for a loan in Italy. So it helps to have a general idea. There are no property taxes on primary residences. So that means if you decide to settle in Italy and live in that apartment or house, you won't pay any property taxes. So that's already a great thing. Second good news, you are not required to have home insurance in Italy. It's highly recommended, but not mandatory. In Italy, we always go for the simplest option, so we pay as little as possible. We tend to live a bit day by day. However, if you have a real estate project, don't hesitate to make an appointment with me so we can discuss it and ultimately set up your roadmap for implementing your project. As I mentioned earlier, if you're from outside the European Union, we also need to plan for the visa aspect. People who are from outside the EU territory can generally stay for a maximum of 90 consecutive days in Italy. You do indeed need to plan for a visa that will allow you to stay longer if you have a project in Italy. So, what types of visas are available? First, there is the work visa. For people who have a contract, you first need to find a work contract, someone who is actually willing to hire you so that you can apply for a work visa. Visas are issued by the Italian consulate in your country of residence. You do indeed need to be able to prove one of these situations. If you are a freelancer, you can actually get the self employment visa. This means that for all entrepreneurs, self employed people, and so on, you can get this type of visa. There is also the attractive option of the digital nomad visa. But in this specific case, you must prove your financial independence that allows you to live comfortably in Italy. Furthermore, the elective residency visa is intended for people who are either fully retired or financially independent. For example, there are people who have annuities, etc., who do not intend to work but can be independent in terms of their visa. There is the student visa for anyone enrolled at a university or, in any case, enrolled in an Italian institution. So you have the possibility to get this visa. Family reunification. If you have someone who lives in Italy permanently, etc., you can apply for this type of visa. And for investors as well, people who want to invest in a startup, in a company, or in any case who want to make investments in Italy, there is also this visa. The particularity of these visas is that once it has been issued, you have 8 days after arriving in Italy to go to the questura to obtain the permesso di soggiorno. So with all your documents, your visa, etc., you have 8 days after your arrival to apply for this permesso di soggiorno. It is absolutely necessary to do this because otherwise you are not following the rules and you risk expulsion if you are ever checked. So be careful with this step. The application for residency comes right after. I would say that this step is the same whether you are from the EU or outside the EU. Applying for residency in Italy becomes mandatory after 3 months of permanent residence. For everyone, you have to go register at the town hall where you live. If you want to stay more than 183 days in the year, it's the same. That's the other requirement in terms and conditions for applying for residency in Italy. You go to the municipality, and generally they ask you for all the documentation regarding your income, work contract, rental agreement, purchase contract, etc. You complete the entire procedure. The town hall registers it. Depending on the case, you can either do it online or you have to go there in person. You have 45 days for this procedure to be validated. That means that within 45 days, the municipal police may come to check if you actually live at the address and if you have indeed made a truthful declaration. And once they have verified that you are indeed at home, they come a bit unexpectedly on Saturday morning, Sunday morning, etc. They validate your registration. For people who are from outside the European Union in their residency application, they must also provide their permesso di soggiorno. This is not something that happens automatically. Be careful with this part because it is quite strictly regulated. It is very closely linked to the healthcare aspect, meaning that either you contribute in Italy, and in that case, because you have a work contract, etc., you automatically apply for residency. If you have a foreign job, etc., you generally need to request a form called S1 in most countries, which allows you to register with the Italian system under the same rules as Italians. So that depends on the agreements in place. Thirdly, still at the time of residency, if on the other hand if you do not pay contributions, you need to take out a supplementary health insurance. So, for example, for people who do not work or for people who are students, etc. So in this case, you will need to take out, in addition, a private health insurance depending on the situation. So there is a different procedure. And this registration for private insurance is generally done before residency. So we need to be able to prove that we can, let's say, support ourselves, that we won't be a burden, at least not a dead weight for Italy. It's not something, as I was saying, that's automatic, even if the whole file is well put together. It's also very closely linked to taxation. So always check for cases of double taxation, or in any case, optimize your taxes with a professional. But in any case, that's, let's say, the procedure. When it comes to taxes, once you're in Italy, there are a few that almost always apply. For example, you may be subject to income tax. So if you work in Italy, know that it's withheld at the source. However, you generally have to file a tax return in Italy, so the following year for the previous year, in order to recover a certain number of expenses. So if you are employed in Italy, whether on a fixed term or permanent contract, you do indeed have the possibility to recover quite a few expenses. For example, health expenses, renovation costs, transportation expenses for commuting to work. So if you have a metro pass, etc., etc. There are also provisions for childcare and veterinary expenses. So there are a lot of expenses that are ultimately deducted from your income tax. So to get those back, you still have to file your tax return the following year for the previous year. Next, there's the household waste tax, the TARI, which depends directly on the town hall. So when you arrive, you have to physically go to the town hall to register for the TARI so that the document is sent directly to your home. It's always up to you to make the request. So be careful. If you don't receive anything, usually around May, you need to take the necessary steps so you can pay without any issues and avoid any consequences later on. The audiovisual tax, the RAI license fee, is deducted directly from your electricity bill. So 90 euros from January to October, so 9 euros per month. And if you don't have a TV, however, it is possible to request an exemption. So on that side, there's nothing to do. And then in Italy, there's the bollo auto, which is a property tax. In reality, this amount actually depends on your car, on the CO2 emission rate, on the region, let's say, on quite a few things. I pay about 260 euros. My partner pays 160 euros. For the TARI tax, it's the same. We pay 250 euros a year, about 260. So that's more or less what you need to plan for in terms of taxes in Italy. I always recommend, let's say, a meeting with a commercialista, so a certified accountant, to really look at your tax situation, possibly always analyze, as we mentioned earlier, your tax status, double taxation, or any other particular situations. I always encourage you to make an appointment together so that we can discuss things and set up, let's say, the right support and see a bit in which order to take the different steps. Every project, as I always say, has its own little variations. So we need to put in place the right support according to your situation. Another important point after taxes is generally the healthcare system. We always worry about how the healthcare system works in Italy. And I have to tell you that I mainly come from the French system. So when I arrived in Italy, well, I discovered some of its particularities. Let's say the local health authority is the ASL. So you need to register at the office that manages, let's say, your municipality. Once you have your residency, you go directly to the ASL, you make an appointment. They ask you for exactly the same, let's say, documentation, the residency document. And so you are given a list of general practitioners who are available, and you choose your own doctor. Generally, this health coverage is either linked to an employment contract or lasts for a maximum of 1 year. So if you have a 6-month fixed term contract, then the coverage will last. So it will be valid for 6 months. You will receive a card valid for 6 months. You will need to renew it when you get a second fixed term contract. Or if you have a self employed business or let's say another type of contract, then it will last for a maximum of 1 year. And so each year you will need to renew it. Once you are registered, you can go to your primary care doctor without any issues. They will write your prescriptions, and you have two options. Either you go to the public sector, meaning the hospital, for example, to see specialist doctors, have tests done, and so on. In this case, each time you have your prescription, you go to your regional website. You can enter the name of the test, or let's say the appointment you need to make. He will give you a list of the next available dates. This means that you may very well find availability in different facilities, in different locations at different dates. So you can choose whichever one you want. I'm in Lombardy, and generally the average wait time is about 2 or 3 weeks, even for MRIs, for example, or other medical imaging tests. In general, it's, let's say, in quotation marks, quite fast. You pay a fee. So generally, it's about 30 euros for each exam. Let's say it works a bit like having supplementary health insurance. So you simply pay a reduced portion, and therefore you have access to all these exams. The availability of doctors depends from one region to another. So it's clear that you first need to see how things work in your region and whether it's better to go to the private sector. If you want to have a particular doctor, even faster availability, etc., you can pay for the exam or at least the visit in the private sector. To give you an idea, right now I'm having several, let's say, visits and several exams done in the private sector. So, for example, a complete blood test costs about 60 euros. For example, the MRI, I paid 30 euros for it in the public sector. Recently, I had an ultrasound done on my own, so in the private sector, and I paid 150 euros for it. Prices generally range between 120 and 150 euros. A visit in the private sector is usually between 120 and 130 euros. Again, it all depends on the professionals. These are expenses that if you have an Italian work contract, you can claim back in the following year's tax return. On my end, I'm in the north, so it works pretty well. That is, I was also hospitalized, so I experienced a bit of both private and public sectors. There are things I do in the public sector and things I do in the private sector, so I combine a bit of both. It's, let's say, the convenience of having, in any case, a system that works and being able to use both depending on your needs. What I always recommend is to arrive without supplementary health insurance, see how things go and what your needs are, and then, if necessary, consider getting one. Very few people in Italy have supplementary health insurance. Generally, it's people who have permanent contracts in companies, so they pay for it through their payslip. This allows them to access private healthcare for free. So there are indeed three options. In some cities, there are also free clinics. So I have a friend who was followed at the clinic throughout all her pregnancies, and she told me it was really, really good. So it's free. You can go without an appointment. It's always different doctors. So why do Italians in the end have so little insurance? Because we realized that we would end up paying much more for mutual insurance compared to the needs we actually have. And in the mindset of Italians, generally, people just take things day by day. So it's clear that in some countries, insurance is mandatory. In others, it brings peace of mind. So it all depends on your needs. Now, if you have something chronic, a chronic illness, you have an exemption code that is applied, which ultimately allows you to get a significant discount on your medication and everything related to exams for your condition. So generally, it's covered. So in reality, it's still a system that works because if you focus on prevention, you either have the option to pay less in the public sector, or if you want something faster, you have the private sector and possibly a supplemental insurance to speed things up. And if you have a medical condition, generally there is very comprehensive coverage. So, in the end, on a case by case basis, you need to look at what your needs are and whether it's necessary. Because supplemental insurances generally start at 700, 800 euros per year. Usually they only cover preventive visits, basic checkups, and so on. So, is it really worthwhile? Generally, you'll always need fewer visits than what is included in the package. And that's it. So it's always a personal calculation, and we can always discuss it during a consultation. You always have the link below. We could talk for hours about moving to Italy, but here I really wanted to give you a summary of the most important things that matter to you. So if you really have a personal project, etc., and you really want answers to your questions, don't hesitate to make an appointment so we can discuss things in more detail and help you build and successfully carry out your project.